Welcome to Newshour. Tonight, a rare signal from Moscow that could reshape the conflict. For the first time since the 2022 invasion, Vladimir Putin has voiced readiness to negotiate directly with Volodymyr Zelenskyy. The move has drawn global attention, but coincides with Ukraine's presence at a UK summit of the so-called Coalition of the Willing, focused on military aid, not peace. At the heart of the talks is a contentious US proposal, recognizing Crimea as Russian territory in exchange for a ceasefire. Well, Zelenskyy has flatly rejected it, insisting Ukraine will not concede land. Is this a turning point then, or a tactical delay by Moscow as Western arms shipments continue? And is Ukraine balancing peace overtures with battlefield realities? We'll go live to our correspondents in Moscow and London and hear from two analysts, one backing Russia's strategy, the other calling for urgent de-escalation. Let's begin with what's being said on the ground and head to Moscow to speak to Dasha Chernyshova, our correspondent there. Dasha, nice to see you as always. How has the Kremlin then framed Putin's willingness to negotiate, and what's the reaction inside Russia?
Well, the Kremlin for days has now been saying that the Russian president is open for the negotiations and finding a negotiated settlement to this conflict in Ukraine. At the same time, the Kremlin also says that while it continues its contacts, particularly with the United States, there are still many nuances around the peace settlement, and said that those are very different positions of the sides that have still to be breached, and the negotiations are ongoing. This is precisely what the focus of the talks is, to find the and how to bridge those gaps. We're also hearing that Moscow is continuing its dialogue with the United States and does cherish the approach of the new American administration. We have heard the Kremlin confirming that Steve Witkoff, US envoy, is due in the Russian capital later this week for the negotiations at the highest level. And also we are hearing that at this stage Moscow is not negotiating with Europe or Ukraine, and Moscow suggests that the position of the Western countries when it comes to the Ukrainian settlements have also been divergent, and they have yet to bridge the gaps, and therefore the summit in London has been scaled down. So this is what Moscow is saying, while also maintaining that to find a negotiated settlement to this conflict in Ukraine, Russia's core national interests have to be taken into account.
Yeah, very interesting indeed. Dasha, thanks very much for joining us from Moscow there. Okay, let's go to London now and speak to A News's Ollie Barrett. Ollie, good to see you. What's being said then at this London summit, particularly regarding Ukraine's military support?
Well, one of the things we're hearing from Ukrainian officials, Guy, after the talks here in London is that they are thanking their allies for the support. We've been hearing from the Ukrainian presidential aide Andrei Yermak, who says, "We're grateful to our partners for their firm support and common desire to end the war as soon as possible." The UK government has also reiterated its support for Ukraine again today. But one of the interesting things about these discussions here in London is that the Foreign Office here behind me was expecting to be hosting foreign minister level talks on Wednesday, but Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, abruptly pulled out on Tuesday, citing scheduling reasons, and therefore the talks in terms of the UK, US, France, Germany and Ukraine meetings were downgraded to technical discussions. Now, David Lammy, the UK Foreign Secretary, John Healey, his Defence Secretary colleague, have met with their Ukrainian counterparts here in London, but otherwise it's been technical level talks here, with the UK reiterating its ongoing support for their Ukrainian allies, and coming out of these discussions here in London, as I say, Ukraine thanking its allies for their support, but also saying, according to the presidential aide, we emphasize that we are committed, he says, to the peace efforts of US President Donald Trump.
Ollie, is there any acknowledgement among UK officials of Russia's apparent olive branch, or is this being dismissed outright?
I don't think it's being dismissed outright, Guy. I think there is some scepticism in diplomatic circles here in the UK, and that's partly illustrated as well with regards to the so-called ceasefire over the Easter weekend. John Healey, the UK Defence Secretary, stood up in the House of Commons and insisted that from the UK perspective, he says that it is believed that Russia violated its own ceasefire with various attacks on Ukraine over that Easter weekend period. And I think that kind of skepticism is extended to Russian overtures at the moment. What the UK wants to avoid is a situation in which its ally, Ukraine, is forced towards a peace deal that isn't in its best interests and doesn't lead to a sustainable peace when it comes to the Ukraine conflict. There is a fear among British officials privately that Ukraine is potentially being moved towards an arrangement that it doesn't want to go ahead with. All of that said, Ukraine insisting it's committed to peace and wants to work with the Americans on this. We've been hearing some positive words coming from some European diplomatic circles as well. But one of the areas of difference you still have is that J.D. Vance today has been saying on his trip to India, reiterating that American position that if Russia and Ukraine don't make progress towards a ceasefire soon, he says that the Americans will walk away. And that, again, is one of the key areas of concern at the Foreign Office here in London, is what happens if and when we do reach that point. How will European allies move forward at that point?
Ollie Barrett for us there in London. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, let's cross now to the geopolitical analyst and senior editor at Issue Insight, Mr. John Kavalik. John, very nice to see you again on Newshour. Let's understand this then. Let's get real about it. Is there a genuine opening here for dialogue, or is this just geopolitical manoeuvring by the Kremlin?
From the Russian perspective, they're clear in that if there is going to be any kind of a stoppage, and I'm hesitating on the word because to use the word peace agreement, it's unlikely that we're going to see a peace agreement. We're going to see more of a frozen conflict. We just don't know how long it's going to be frozen for. But there is an opportunity for something to happen that we would all consider to be good. What's critical is, from the Russian standpoint, they look at what's happening in terms of three parties: themselves, the Ukrainians, and the US. They do not look at Europe as a party to a resolving of the conflict. And that's a problem for the Europeans, because they know, and you keyed in on what Vice President Vance was saying, in terms of, if we feel that we've gone as far as we can go, then we're out, we're done. For the Europeans, that's in some respects their worst nightmare, because it throws then everything onto them. But from the Trump administration, that's precisely a result that they would not discourage, because they wanted Europe to do more anyway. So from the Trump administration standpoint, whatever happens, it's somewhat of a win for them. And from the Russian Federation standpoint and from the Ukrainian standpoint, there are no winners. This is all a degree of how much you don't want are you willing to accept.
And John, you mentioned their involvement, or rather lack of involvement, of Europe in this process, these negotiations. If direct talks are ever agreed, what role do you expect neutral states to play? In fact, and who will those mediators be?
And I think part of teeing that up is the statement that has been purported to be a part of the Trump administration outline, which is a recognition of Crimea as Russian territory. Now, some of the reporting has been that it is not that Ukraine needs to recognize Crimea as Russian territory. It is the US that's going to recognize Crimea as Russian territory. Now, from the Russian standpoint, that's almost better, because it adds more of a legitimacy. And for the Trump administration, there is history with this, and that is the Golan Heights. During President Trump's first term, he went and said, well, yes, the Golan Heights does belong to Syria, but the state of Israel has controlled it for a long time. And then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said, we're recognizing realities on the ground, and the realities on the ground say that Israel controls it, so we're recognizing Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights, which of course no one else in the rest of the world agreed with. The UN didn't agree with it, EU didn't agree with it, other NATO members didn't agree with it, but the US did it, and who benefited? Israel. So in this regard, what Russia is looking is for the US to do some things unilaterally, and they're okay with that because then they can move forward the bilateral relationship with the US. But in terms of actually getting Ukraine to say that we are giving up this property, we're giving up this real estate, the Russians know that the Ukrainians aren't going to mean it. The Ukrainians don't trust the Russians in terms of anything they're going to sign. So it really becomes a matter of optics and theatrics. You're going to put on the paper whatever you need to put on the paper to stop the war. And then some years down the road, maybe this will start again, maybe it won't. But right now it's what do you need to do to make it stop? And from the Trump administration, a lot of it's optics, but it is what does Russia want that we can give to Russia, put aside what Ukraine wants and what Russia needs from Ukraine.
Very interesting, John. Let's just go back to Crimea specifically. Do you think it's likely that the US recognizing Crimea might set off similar claims elsewhere, undermining international norms?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're President Xi in China and you see that the Trump administration has now just recognized a land grab, it makes it easier when you're modeling the outcomes for grabbing Taiwan. If you're Cyprus, and there we have a frozen conflict with the southern part as a European Union member, the northern part connected with Turkey. Well, if you're President Erdogan, you may say, well, maybe this is a time to force a reunification. If you're Israel, you're then looking at Gaza, which the Trump administration has already said, we're okay with turning it into Acapulco or a resort community for the state of Israel. So that gives more of a substance, more of a get out of jail free card or political checkoff. And so, yes, it absolutely could set in motion some blocks, political blocks that could fall. But for the Trump administration, President Trump looks at one win at a time. And so it's do this, check it off. If there are consequences, those come later because I got the win yesterday, and that's what matters.
John, if it's the case that we've reached a kind of sort of diplomatic stalemate when it comes to territory, are there other alternatives, other incentives, other things that can be agreed on both sides, separate to the issue of territorial compromise?
It's hard to see that, this is really about real estate, and it sort of melds well with President Trump's background in real estate, because is Russia grabbing 20% of the real estate of Ukraine and saying we're not giving it back. Ukraine saying we want it back. So that is unlikely to change. And so what happens next? And when you move past, which I think is where you're going, when you move past, how do you deal with these real estate issues or with these tangibles, and then you get into the intangibles or what else is there. And you're talking about NATO membership, talking about EU membership. For the United States, the resurrecting the bilateral relationship with Russia, whether it's air travel. No one's really talking about the $320 billion in central bank of Russia assets that are frozen. In the U.S., we have about five or 10 billion of it, and the Russians have floated out, well, Donald, we could use that money to buy Boeing aircraft. And of course, the European Union is saying, no, that money's supposed to go to reconstruction. But some politicians say, no, it should go to buy more military equipment. So there aren't a lot of agreements amongst all of the parties, including the Europeans, in terms of what is the goal. We used to have in the Biden administration, as long as it takes, as long as we can, and then it slowly migrated to maybe as long as we should be. And then the Trump administration came in and changed it all.
John, let's just go back to those talks that are taking place, that have been taking place in the UK. What do you feel about Ukraine's alignment with this military coalition? It seems to be a very close alignment. Do you feel that risks undermining prospects for peace, or is it just a common sense necessary safeguard?
Optically, the coalition, it sounds good. It allows diplomatic engagement, it allows military engagement among themselves. But in the end, as we've already seen, the European Union and then the coalition of the willing, which in this case includes some European Union countries and the UK, the closer they get to having to make a decision about how much to spend, how many people are involved, where are those people going to be, who's going to pay for them, all of a sudden we need more consultations and we need more discussions. And then you get the heads of state and the heads of government starting to say, well, maybe this or that. So from the Ukrainian standpoint, I think it's a mistake to connect, so surgically with the coalition of the willing and believing that in some way that's that the reality of that is going to be either an impediment or a deterrent to President Putin, because President Putin also knows that these countries are not going to want to send troops into an area where they could get killed, because no head of state or head of government wants to welcome back the casket of a young man or a young woman and say, well, sorry, family, this person was killed because they were standing in between a Russian and a Ukrainian. And the taxpayers of that country are going to go, what are you doing? So they want to avoid all that. And in the end, I think that the coalition of the willing is going to be more of a theatrical presentation than it's going to be something that actually is going to be deployed anywhere within the territory of Ukraine.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You speak there about the differences between the, as you put it, theatrical presentation, the rhetoric, and then those hard realities. How do you reconcile Russia's peace rhetoric then, John, with ongoing military activity in eastern Ukraine?
That's all about elasticity, and simply put, President Putin, because of the structure of his government, has far more elasticity to do what he wants to do to achieve his objective. Meaning, if it requires announcing that we're going to stop military operations, but then we don't, or announcing that we're going to not target specific areas, and we continue to do so. But most importantly, he has an ability to target schools and libraries and railway stations and bus stations and apartment buildings and hospitals and metro stations where President Zelenskyy doesn't have that elasticity, because governments that are supplying the military hardware will not permit it. And his own taxpayers will not permit him to behave the same way that the Russians are behaving toward Ukraine. So you have this elasticity theory, and until they match up, the Russians, have the advantage. And so for President Putin, when he makes statements and then the statements turn out not to be true or turned out to be questionable, he has that elasticity to be able to just continue on and do it again. Where President Zelenskyy, when he sees that a school's been blown up or a bus has been blown up, and children have been killed, and he wants revenge, and his people want revenge, and his military people want revenge. He can't do the same thing to Russia that Russia has done to him. And that break has always been the Achilles heel for Ukraine, quote, winning this war.
John, you know better than most that diplomacy often relies on very painful trade-offs, on compromise. Do you think that there's a lack of recognition by some parties of that harsh reality, and just the generic calls for absolute peace are not helpful? There's a time now for a more pragmatic approach.
I've watched now this trajectory, for 4 years, but then, as sometimes people forget, this war didn't begin on the 24th of February, 2022. It began February of 2014, going into Crimea. So we're at basically the second major chapter of the same book. And over the time, the last 4 years, we've all looked at on social media, or we've listened to reports, and we've read reports, and we've read people's statements, and they've been impassioned, they've been full of emotion that Russia should just get out, that Ukraine should win, that Ukraine must win, that NATO must give Ukraine what it needs to win. And that's all been important at its moments. And President Zelenskyy, I will never sit down and negotiate with Putin. I will never negotiate with Russia. I will never give this. I will never negotiate that.
John,
the same way.
Sorry, forgive me for butting in, but that's a really interesting point. Zelenskyy has taken a very hard line, hasn't he, when it comes to not ceding any territory. Can that possibly stay the course?
No, but politically, he needs to maintain that posture that I'm not going to be the president of Ukraine that hands over 20% of our country and says, "Have a nice day, Mr. Putin." So he has to maintain that position, and then also, in order to continue to get support from outside of Ukraine, he has to say, we still want that territory back. And most importantly, I need you to believe European Union. I need you to believe NATO. I need you to believe President Biden, now President Trump, that if you give us what we say we need, we can push them out. We can take it back. And some years ago, we're talking, within the last couple of years, President Zelenskyy and his military people saying, hey, you give us, Germany, you give us the Taurus missiles, we can go after the Kerch Bridge, we can push them out of Crimea and get that back. The US and NATO were saying, hey, look, that's a bridge too far, leave that alone. So there's been this, this push and pull, but President Zelenskyy has had to maintain the public posture that everything is possible to go back to the way it was on the 23rd of February, 2022. And I need you to support me. But what happens over time, he runs out of people, he runs out of money, and governments, their taxpayers get more frustrated because they want to see an end to this, they want to see a result. And all that closes in on him faster than it closes in on President Putin.
John, let's talk about
And
realism.
that's where we are.
Exactly. Let's talk about realism here. You know, somebody has to give in. Somebody has to cede something sometime soon. Who's it going to be?
Well, I would posit that Russia and Ukraine have already given. President Putin, on February 24th, 2022, he went all in, and he came from, Lukashenko in Belarus allowed the troops to come in from the north to go and try to grab Kiev. They then came from the east and tried to grab, tried to move west. The Ukrainians stopped them. And so for President Putin, he spent the last going 4 years now with not a lot of result in terms of getting more real estate. He lost a good amount of what he wanted. He's not going to get his overall goal, which is all of Ukraine. That's not going to happen. He doesn't have the capacity to do it. So there he is with, I'm not getting what I want, which is I wanted all of Ukraine. I'm getting a little more than I sort of started with. It's cost me a pile load of money. It's going to continue to cost the Russian Federation a lot of money. So I can roughly call it a day and say that I've won, because when I started this on the 24th of February 2022, I was attacking the army of Ukraine. But by April of 2025, Russia has held back NATO. One country, Russia, has held back 32 members of NATO. So he can spin that into a win. In addition, and the fact that over time, he's becoming re-welcomed into the world community. For Ukraine, for President Zelenskyy, he's held off the largest, prepared army in the world that had a mission not just to destroy, but to exterminate, to absorb completely, and do whatever it took to achieve that goal. And the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian people, despite a lot of suffering, have held Russia back. So for President Zelenskyy, he's able to say, Russia didn't win. Even now, he's able to say they didn't win because they didn't get what they wanted, which was they wanted Ukraine. So I go back to where somewhat began. This isn't about Russia and Ukraine declaring victory because they're both getting what they want. It's about who's going to accept more to walk away and say, I've won. And we're sort of there, and that's where the Trump administration, I think, is very cleverly and very publicly, in a way that is unusual. I mean, we're watching a diplomatic dance unfold publicly in ways that it's sort of like the audience production booth of your network, and the director and the producer and the scriptwriter are all there, and we're watching this all in real time.
Yeah,
so
I mean, that's
it's unusual.
That's a good analogy, John, and you're right. It is unusual. One of the things that is unusual are these threats to walk away from negotiations that we've heard from the US. What do you make of those threats? How likely are they? And if they do happen, when might they happen?
I think President Trump is being true to his word when he says we're prepared to walk away, and that is his real estate DNA. Politicians, their DNA is they see an issue and they adhere themselves to it. But if something goes wrong, they're not very good at detaching themselves from it. Where Donald Trump has shown by his past real estate dealings that he doesn't get married to an issue to the point where he's going to allow it to bring him down. He will recalibrate and re-justify the reasons he walked away. And some will say, it's a failure, you're just disguising it as a victory. But he is prepared to walk away because in his mind, he will have done what he said he was going to do. And I know that you'll probably go back to, I'm going to end it in 24 hours. I'm going to end it while I'm president-elect. I'm going to end it, within weeks. But he is very good at continuing to redefine what it is he said and what it is he meant to do. And so he will look at this. If he does walk away, he's going to say, look, the war began not under Donald Trump. Donald Trump tried in good faith to make something work. These people just want to keep killing each other. I've tried all sorts of things. And to demonstrate how hard I've tried, there are many people that haven't been happy with what I've offered to both countries. So I must have been doing something pretty well to at least try to make a good stab at this. But he will then say, if they want to keep killing each other, let them. But he also gains from that because he's then able to push this to Europe, which has been a goal all along of his, to have Europe have to play a larger role. And in this case, he'll be able to say, I tried, be my guest, European Union, Keir Starmer in the UK, members of NATO, see if you can do any better than Donald Trump. And he will take that as a victory and then move on.
Very interesting indeed. John, thank you as always for joining us. Geopolitical analyst John Kavalik there. Thank you very much indeed for your insights and analysis. And that's where we leave it on Newshour for tonight. A Russian offer to talk, a Western summit for war, two parallel tracks with very different destinations. But is there a junction ahead or more divergence to come? From everyone here at A News, goodbye for now.